Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, is a groundbreaking feminist text that continues to resonate across the world. De Beauvoir, a French existentialist philosopher, engages deeply with the role of women in society and challenges the traditional understanding of femininity. Through her analysis, she attempts to deconstruct the myths that have been used to justify female oppression. De Beauvoir's text is a combination of existentialism, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and historical investigation, making it one of the most comprehensive studies of gender in modern history. The title of the book itself reflects a core argument. Women are often seen as the second sex, always defined in relation to men. This othering of women is central to de Beauvoir's critique, and throughout the book, she unpacks the ways in which society constructs and enforces female subordination. She contends that women's identity has been shaped not by any inherent nature, but by societal norms and expectations. Existentialist roots of the second sex. De Beauvoir's philosophical grounding lies in existentialism, a movement associated with figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was also her longtime intellectual companion. Existentialism focuses on the individual's experience, freedom, and responsibility, and de Beauvoir applies these concepts to the question of women's liberation. She argues that women, like men, must take responsibility for their own freedom. The oppression of women, she asserts, is not a biological destiny but a social construct that can be changed through individual and collective action. One of the key existentialist principles that de Beauvoir applies is that of becoming. In existentialist thought, human beings are not defined by an essential nature. Instead, they are in a constant process of becoming through their actions. De Beauvoir uses this idea to argue that one is not born, but rather becomes, a woman, challenging the idea that gender is biologically determined. The construction of the other. One of de Beauvoir's most famous concepts in The Second Sex is the idea of woman as the other. She draws on the existentialist notion that individuals define themselves in relation to others, but in patriarchal society, men are defined as the norm or the standard, while women are relegated to the status of the other. In this way, women are always defined in opposition to men and denied the opportunity to define themselves independently. De Beauvoir argues that throughout history, men have created a world in which they are the subject and women are the object. This has led to a system where women are considered inferior and secondary to men. The construction of woman as the other has justified her subjugation in various realms of life, including politics, economics, and culture. Historical oppression of women. De Beauvoir traces the historical development of women's oppression, showing how gender roles have been constructed over time. She examines women's position in prehistory, ancient civilizations, the Middle Ages, and the modern period. Her historical analysis reveals that women's subordination has been maintained through myths, religious doctrines, and cultural practices that reinforce male dominance. In ancient Greece, for instance, women were excluded from public life and confined to the domestic sphere, a division that persisted in various forms throughout history. In medieval Europe, the rise of Christianity further cemented women's secondary status, with religious texts emphasizing their role as subservient to men. The Enlightenment, despite its ideals of liberty and equality, failed to extend these principles to women, who remained politically and socially disenfranchised. De Beauvoir criticizes the ways in which male-dominated institutions, such as religion and science, have perpetuated the myth of female inferiority. She points to figures like St. Thomas Aquinas, who argued that women were inherently weaker than men, both physically and intellectually. These ideas, de Beauvoir contends, have been used to justify women's exclusion from power and their confinement to domestic roles, women's complicity in their own oppression. De Beauvoir also explores the ways in which women themselves have contributed to their own oppression. She argues that many women have internalized the societal myths about their inferiority and have accepted their subordinate role without question. This internalization of oppression, according to de Beauvoir, is one of the greatest obstacles to women's liberation. However, de Beauvoir does not blame individual women for their complicity in the system of oppression. Instead, she emphasizes that this acceptance of subordination is the result of centuries of conditioning. From an early age, women are taught to be passive, submissive, and dependent on men. Society rewards women for conforming to these roles, while punishing those who challenge the status quo. De Beauvoir insists that in order for women to achieve true liberation, they must reject these socially imposed roles and assert their own freedom. This process requires both individual and collective action, as women must work together to dismantle the structures that have oppressed them. The myth of the eternal feminine. Central to de Beauvoir's critique is the idea of the myth of the eternal feminine, a concept that she uses to describe the way in which society has constructed an idealized image of women that is based on male fantasies rather than reality. This myth portrays women as passive, nurturing, and self-sacrificing, qualities that serve to reinforce their subordination to men. De Beauvoir argues that the myth of the eternal feminine has been used to justify the exclusion of women from public life and to confine them to the roles of wife and mother. This idealization of femininity, she contends, is a form of oppression that limits women's potential and prevents them from achieving true autonomy. In addition to limiting women's roles, the myth of the eternal feminine also serves to absolve men of responsibility for women's oppression. By portraying women as naturally suited to domesticity and motherhood, the myth suggests that their subordination is a result of biology rather than social structures. De Beauvoir rejects this view, arguing that women's oppression is a social construct that can and must be dismantled. Existential freedom and women's liberation. At the heart of the second sex is de Beauvoir's call for women to embrace their existential freedom. She argues that women, like men, are free beings who must take responsibility for their own lives. However, in a patriarchal society, women are often denied the opportunity to exercise their freedom. De Beauvoir contends that this denial of freedom is one of the primary ways in which women are oppressed. De Beauvoir calls on women to reject the roles that society has imposed on them and to assert their own agency. This process, she argues, requires a radical rethinking of gender roles and the structures that have upheld them. Women must recognize that their identity is not determined by their biology, but by the choices they make. De Beauvoir's vision of women's liberation is not limited to the individual level. She also calls for collective action to dismantle the social, political, and economic structures that have oppressed women for centuries. She envisions a society in which women and men are equal partners, free to define themselves on their own terms. Impact and legacy of the second sex. Since its publication, The Second Sex has had a profound impact on feminist thought and activism. The book helped to lay the intellectual foundations for the feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly the movement for women's liberation. De Beauvoir's analysis of women's oppression, her critique of traditional gender roles, and her call for existential freedom continue to inspire feminists around the world. The book has also been the subject of significant debate and criticism. Some have argued that de Beauvoir's existentialist framework is too individualistic, and that it fails to fully account for the structural nature of women's oppression. Others have critiqued de Beauvoir's lack of attention to issues of race and class, arguing that the second sex focuses primarily on the experiences of white, middle-class women. Despite these criticisms, The Second Sex remains a foundational text in feminist philosophy. Its analysis of the social construction of gender, the myth of the eternal feminine, and the existential call for women's liberation continues to shape feminist thought and activism today. Simone de Beauvoir's work challenges us to rethink our assumptions about gender, freedom, and the possibilities for social change.